Good afternoon. So most of the case studies you're going to hear this afternoon are about schools that are maybe 25 to 50 years old. Our case study is going to be about much older schools. We're going to be looking at transforming old schools that are important to their communities for either their architectural or their cultural significance. Replacing schools like this would be impossible today. The question we're going to try to answer is there a way to move these older schools toward zero net energy and zero net water? So we have schools like this in every region, every climate zone in the state. Our particular case study is looking at Santa Barbara High School. It's in the coastal zone, but we've looked at data from all over the state. And we think there are lessons that are applicable to this for the entire state and some even for new schools. So Santa Barbara High School was built in 1924. It's a Spanish Revival school, very, very beautiful. In 2005, it was declared a California Historic Landmark. You can see some of the quality of the architectural detailing. Like many historic schools, or many of our old schools, it's a cast-in-place concrete building. It has steam heating systems. And these are still in service, usually after up to 90 plus years. Most of the schools have no cooling system, even in the inland areas. So we're going to try to see how we can take these existing elements and use them to move toward zero net energy, zero net water. As these schools are modernized, we have opportunities to begin to take steps toward net zero. But because of the historic nature of the buildings, there are some things we don't think we really want to do, because we don't want to install features that are going to take away from the architectural qualities that we're trying to save. We are going to review steps that we can take with every modernization as to try to move toward net zero. Steps that would improve education, move us toward 21st century learning, steps to reduce water use. We don't need to get there all at once, but it is important that we begin to take steps and that we make the right steps. We don't want to build things now that we need to change later in order to get closer to zero. A lot of work needs to be done on these buildings. We'd like to tie every modernization to some element of energy and water savings. Every step we take to modernize needs to be very carefully thought through. We need to think about energy modernization as a long-term process, a process with a transition plan, much like the ADA transition plans that we have, so that each step builds toward net zero. Let's look at one example, a very common example, replacing school windows. These schools have old wooden windows. They're in physically poor condition. They're drafty. They're very high maintenance. They let a lot of heat in and let a lot of heat out. And they use clear glass, which has no shading factor. What we found is that the rooms are uncomfortably hot. And to control this, the users close the blinds. That helps a little bit to block the heat and glare. But then they turn on the electric lights. So we have these beautiful old schools with very large windows that were actually designed for daylighting. And we end up using electric light almost every day of the year. Lighting accounts for about 60% of the electric energy used in schools. And we can't ever get to net zero if we don't start using daylighting for our buildings. So when we do replace windows, it's really important to make the right steps. We can't just replace the windows to the minimum energy standards. If we do that, we'll solve two of the problems we've got. We'll have nice new windows, and we will start to reduce envelope heat loss. But we can't solve the biggest problem, which is the problem that contributes the most energy, which is direct solar gain. In order to do that, we need to actually invest in high-performance glazing. Glazing that stops heat energy from coming through the glass. It's a lot more expensive, but if you're worried about the cost to install this kind of glass, imagine the higher energy, if you don't do it, imagine the higher energy costs you're going to have to pay. Imagine the natural daylighting you're not going to be able to have in your classrooms. And imagine how much more expensive it's going to be when you have to replace that glass again to control heat gain. There are some other steps that you could take later. For example, adding interior light shelves. They can reflect light deep into the classroom. This could result in about a 70% electric lighting reduction. Another future step would be to replace the fluorescent lighting with LED lighting, which could result in about a 90% electric energy savings. This would get the lighting energy use down to about 28,000 kilowatt hours per year. If you think about supplying that electricity on site, it means you'll be paying for a lot fewer photovoltaics. So you can, replacing windows is really key as a step toward moving to net zero energy for lighting. We can improve the quality of our education as we do that at the same time. Now I'm going to introduce Aaron Wintersmith, who's going to talk about some of the steps to reducing energy and providing more energy efficient heating. Thank you.
Thanks, Chad. So as Chad mentioned, the existing heating system for this campus is a steam heating system, which is really typical of buildings of this age. The issues we have with the ceiling heating system start with its age, right? 90 plus years. Really the action left to take with that is to replace it. It also suffers from a low inherent fuel efficiency, a high cost of ownership due to the fuel and maintenance. And there's really a limited opportunity to use energy you might generate on site because the steam system uses such hot water. It's really presenting a barrier towards moving to net zero on the campus. I think the cooling system is pretty straightforward in that there is none and the users expect there to be one. It's really a distraction to the classroom environment without it. So our solution needs to provide cooling for that space to meet the user's expectations. The first step for the heating system is really to replace the existing steam system with a hot water system. In this case, for the first step, we're proposing a condensing gas boiler. What this does is transition the system to a different source that is much more able to use energy that we might be able to generate on site. In this case, the lower temperature water is very useful and can be generated by solar hot water heating panels on the roof, right? So we cut our reliance on fossil fuels. And the proposal here using radiant heating in the classroom doesn't have any moving parts in the classroom, which really improves the classroom experience. Step 2 for this system would be to change the source here. You can see we moved to a hot water, a heat pump boiler. What this does is it removes the CO2 pollution on site by getting rid of that natural gas boiler and leverages those other systems, right? This system continues to use solar hot water, but it also uses the electricity generated by the on-site PV panels, raising their utilization factor and really improving the economics of that overall system. In this case, the source of that hot water is flexible per site. For Santa Barbara, we've proposed an air source heat pump boiler, but other sites might look at using a water source boiler or a ground source boiler. To get cooling in the classroom, we would use the same radiant panels that we've proposed for the heating system. Again, no moving parts in the classroom, improves the environment. And this system allows flexible sources like we saw in step 2 of the heating system. We show here a classic boiler system backed up by a cooling tower. So that is probably the most conservative layout of this for the inland climates. In Santa Barbara, we believe you could eliminate the chiller entirely and use only the cooling tower, which is a very low energy solution. You could also use new technology. We're starting to see air-cooled chillers that have a lot of variable speed capacity and very high efficiencies. You could use that source on site. So all of these work together to move you along the steps towards net zero while providing a flexible path. Amy's going to talk about water savings.
Water, it tastes good. Anybody here not a fan of water? I didn't think so. So I have the right crowd. Let's all agree that today is the day that we change the way we think about water. Let's get that thirst quenching feeling from not only the way we use water for our bodies, but also how we use water in our buildings. So with Santa Barbara being a historical school, that the facade is really valuable to us, the plumbing is definitely at the end of its lifespan and is ready to be replaced. So instead of replacing it in kind, I'm suggesting to put in a dual system, 2 supply lines and 2 drains. By putting in a plumbing infrastructure that recycles water, we're now clearing the path for a net zero water future. And what that future looks like is collecting the 300,000 gallons of rainwater that falls on the roof each year, treating it to non-potable standards, and reusing it as we collect it to flush the toilets. This is relatively easy. We know how to do this right now, whether or not regulation supports this. Step 2, which is also rather easy, is collecting the gray water, so water from washing your hands, treating it to potable standards, and using that water also to flush the toilets. So now, with the rainwater and the gray water, 100% of the potable water that you were using to flush the toilets is now recycled water. And that's a good step to moving forward. But what gets really interesting is putting in a wastewater treatment facility on site. So now, as you use water to flush the toilets, you're treating it on site with a constructed wetlands and some tanks, some filters, and reusing that continuously to flush the toilets. I think this is really important to close the water loop on campus. Now, this is much, much more difficult, but it's not impossible. So dream with me for a second for step 4. And that's taking the rainwater and the gray water and treating that to potable water standards so that now you have potable water on site. You have closed both the loops on site. And that's what we're going to do, but that still doesn't give us that thirst quenching feeling yet. What comes out of these possibilities is we change our image of schools, right? We're no longer thinking of a historic school with a beautiful grassy lawn. We're thinking of a historic school with a constructed wetland in front of it that starts to be a working system of the building. You have water labs. If you're treating the water on site, you have a laboratory for which you can educate kids on how water is treated on site. You also start to bring up the discussion of externalized cost. By treating water on site, you're no longer externalizing the cost of that water treatment. You can also begin to discuss in schools the externalized cost of cheap fossil fuels, right? And that's a discussion we should have earlier and earlier, so when students today are in charge of making decisions for our community, they're better prepared to do that. And then lastly, when we have a system that provides potable water for our schools become the hub of the community. What if, in the event of an emergency, like an earthquake or a terror attack, the water that we're piping in from several miles away, we don't have access to that anymore. So if a school is able to provide that for the community, you're able to get through that emergency, repair those systems, and get back to working order. So I know today we have talked a lot about big steps, and those are not going to happen overnight. But I want us all to agree that today we will start making steps toward a better future, and that's with the modernizations that we are doing. We no longer block the path to a sustainable future, but we make decisions that will lead to a sustainable future. Thank you.